Sandy Rosen, then Benedicta Torres Lopez, and Patrick Sicanolfi.
Good afternoon. I'm here to represent the small landlord. I own a 6-family house in Brooklyn. It has been family.
Please listen to each of everyone offering testimony. It's important to hear every voice. Thank you.
It has been family owned for over 50 years. It has been more and more difficult for me to maintain my property. My building taxes coming up are over $14,000 for a 6-family home. That's just the real estate taxes. My water bill has gone up over 8%. My national grid, which is gas, has gone up an 8% increase. And my insurance to cover my building has gone up. Plus, the demands that they request small landlords to do now because of Hurricane Sandy are mandatory. If you don't comply with certain things, they will drop your insurance. You must have fire extinguishers and walk-ups. Then there is no flexibility or room to give a landlord an opportunity, a small landlord, to be able to make these improvements within a reasonable period of time. Now, electricians and plumbers have increased their prices, I know, because I've made repairs. New and replacement purchases are also more expensive. It's the cost of living. We all pay more and get less. And that holds true for tenants. I'm very fair. However, how do you propose I keep my building up and running? I'm not a large building. In order to get deregulation, the rents must reach $2,500. In many cases, small landlords, their tenants, have been living there for many, many years, paid the basic increases, and have not reached anywhere near $2,500. It used to be $2,200 or perhaps $2,250. Now, this is not a big money-making proposition for a small landlord. It's an investment, but this is not like large buildings where when deregulation goes in, you get foreign investors, you get people who are willing to spend thousands upon thousands, and yes, people do get pushed out. I'm a small landlord. I'm 6 families. I'm a 3-floor walk-up. There are many of us out there. Mine is in Brooklyn. They're all over Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens. How do we keep going? How do we subsist when things keep increasing and we will not get anything to compensate us? Now, if you want to freeze rent, then come up with a solution that's equitable to everyone. Are you going to tell National Grid not to increase my gas costs? Tell the water board you are not allowed to raise water for this year. Let's see, what else can I say? Electricity. You're going to tell Con Edison not to raise their prices. As soon as there's a blackout, they're going to fix it and they're going to increase my electricity for the building. Either freeze or freeze these companies from increasing our costs. You have to have commensurate ability for both tenant and landlord. And you cannot compare a small building to a large building. You can't. We get the same charges, we get the same problems that a large building does, but we don't get the same revenue. And although the tenants have their plight, if you want a small landlord, and they're all over the East Village, they're Upper West Side, they're on the Upper East Side, we're not all millionaires that live here in this city, certainly not in the boroughs, landlords will wind up reducing the services so that they can pay the real estate bill, or they're going to pay whatever maintenance, because they're going to reduce it. There's no question. There are good landlords and there are slumlords. But if you don't compensate somewhere down the line, however you do it, a rebate, a refund at the end of the year to a small landlord for expenses they've paid, trust me, the services will go down. It has to. Eventually, a small landlord's going to get disgusted because they're not making big bucks, and they're going to reduce services, or they're going to sell the building, or they're going to walk away from it. Now, if anybody was still around in the 1970s, this city became a hellhole. Buildings were abandoned, there was graffiti all over the place, and that, if you keep avoiding that issue, eventually over time, there will be bigger problems here, trust me. And as far as, what Jack Freund said is true. There are ways to help tenants that cannot afford. I had a tenant that was on scree. So yes, If there are council people out there, they should advise the tenants to contact the Rent Stabilization Association or help them get all the aid that's necessary. This way, the landlord does get some kind of assistance so they can keep their building running. It should be fair and equitable for everyone, not one, not the other. Now, you tell me how to do it.
Thank you. I have a question. What percentage, my understanding from our data is that 50% of tenants in all buildings, but in small buildings particularly, sign 2-year leases as opposed to 1-year leases. Is that your experience?
Yes, because that's just the nature of the beast. I mean, there was a time there were actually, I heard, I didn't have the building then, or maybe my mother did, it was 3-year leases. So that's gone by the board. But that doesn't solve the problem. The problem is, how do you stop increasing costs for running buildings that are small? What do you do? Tell me, because I can't come up with a solution. I said, if you don't want to raise rents, give the landlords a refund or a rebate at the end of the year for increased costs to run the building. You've got to do something. If it isn't one thing, it's got to be another.
Any other questions from the board?
Sorry. Hi, thank you for your testimony. How many units total do you own?
6.
And what is your rent roll like? How many are destabilized?
None.
None?
None.
And what is your profit margin?
Very minimal. If I make, in a good year, 25 to 30,000, there are more people here that get more than that on scree. I mean, it's ridiculous. People must be under an illusion that people that own small buildings are multimillionaires. We're all making big money. We're all in this to get loaded. We're going to be very rich. No, it's not the case. My parents had no money. They got a loan, and they bought the 6-family house, so they had a place to live instead of paying rent, and they can make a little money. Well, the little money is staying little money. I haven't gained that much over time. Do you think running a building and only earning that is fair when yes, there are people that take advantage, and they're making multi-millions? That has nothing to do with me and many small landlords here. You've got to have a separate law. Why don't you go and propose to your council people a different set of laws and rules for the small landlord and not lump us in with multi-billion-dollar buildings, because that's the issue.
Any further questions from the board?
Thank you very much, Ms. Rosen. I really appreciate this. Wait, ma'am, Ms. Rosen.
Ms. Rosen?
Sorry, I actually had a question for you.
If you're willing.
Sorry, I was thanking you, but also I had a question for you.
Thank you.
We started out the testimony this morning with people talking about the NOIs of landlords going up by 9.6% last year. And then I think, again, that 30% number from 1990, which was on average inflation adjusted about 1.7%. But what I wanted to clarify was that unfortunately you are not represented in that NOI number at all. Those come from buildings that are 10 units and above, and that also includes commercial income as well as destabilized rental income. And so unfortunately the math that we are given both from the tenant side as well as the information that just is readily available does not speak to exactly your situation, which happens to be a very large percentage of the rent stabilized.
Absolutely correct. So how do you deal with that? Tell me what we do. What do you do?
I asked that question to my fellow board members as well. I've been surprised to see how limited the Rent Guidelines Board is in trying to help. I mean, everything from getting better information, having agencies, state and city agencies work together to provide better data, to even bifurcating potentially rent increases. There are potential ways, and we absolutely are committed to try to figure out what there are to at the very least represent the people that we are trying to determine the fate of, as well as maybe that there's some other ways to slice this that, you know, it feels like sometimes trying to reinvent the wheel, but I completely thank you for your testimony and also that you speak for who has not spoken here before.
Yeah, I appreciate you acknowledging that. I mean, you're here to help everyone. Perhaps you need more power. Maybe you guys should have greater power with your councilmen to say, here is the situation. You can only go so far. You're going to make your decision. But really, there's no power behind the throne here. You need power. We all need power because, you know, it can't just be one-sided. Again, I want to thank you for understanding what I'm saying. Even 10 families may have the same issue I do. I'm just saying you have to have a separate law for small landlords. And those are the ones you're going to see all over here that will eventually, although this gentleman may not agree with me or anyone else, eventually they're going to give up. The decent landlords will give up and they'll say, I've had enough. Because there's a limit. You know, it isn't big business, but it's a little business, and if you don't make money in a little business, you let it go.
So I just want to confirm, ma'am, I just want to confirm what you're saying, that you think we should treat people like you differently than we treat the large landlords. So you may be entitled to a different increase than they're entitled because you have higher needs. That's what you're telling us?
What I'm saying is you shouldn't lump. You can't generalize anything in life.
Thank you very
Okay?
much. I appreciate that. Thank you.
We'd like to invite the Speaker of the House, Melissa Mark Viverento, please. You may have noticed, but I just actually gave you a promotion to Speaker of the House. So
I know, I got that. I was like, hey, not bad. No, I appreciate it. Good afternoon to everyone that is here tonight, to the Rent Guidelines Board. I'm Speaker Melissa Mark Viverito. I am the council member for the 8th District, which includes El Barrio, East Harlem, and the South Bronx. The affordable housing crisis is deeply impacting almost every household in the city. This is a challenge we must face head-on. It cannot be solved unless we commit to ending the distressing loss of our existing stock of affordable housing. This means not just preventing further deregulation of apartments, but also ensuring that rent-stabilized apartments are in fact affordable. Unfortunately, the rent guidelines handed down since the Great Recession began have worked to undermine this goal. That is why I'm calling for a rent freeze this year. New York City, and I know that many of my other colleagues have come as well and said the same message. New York City was hit especially hard by the recession and is yet to fully recover, with income still down and an unemployment rate at least 8 points higher than the national. Despite this, the Rent Guidelines Board has handed down sizable rent increases every year since the recession began. In the face of the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, the board protected landlords' profit margins even as tenants in regulated apartments were on average getting by with less. Since 2007, landlords' net operating income has grown by 32%, whereas their costs only grew by half as much. 2 years ago, landlords enjoyed their largest year-to-year increase in operating income since the Giuliani era. Yet tenants' median household income fell by 3% from 2007 to 2010. This city is becoming increasingly unaffordable for the working families who are its lifeblood. Half of all renting households, including 81% of low-income households, are rent-burdened. Nearly a third of all renting households are severely rent-burdened, meaning they pay at least half of their gross income in rent. The consistent rent hikes of the past 7 years mean that more and more tenants of stabilized units are becoming rent-burdened. Led down by the promise of rent regulation and forced to choose between paying their rent on time and putting food on the table. Rent stabilization is crucial to maintaining the racial and economic diversity of our neighborhoods. Over 60% of rent-stabilized tenants are people of color, and their median household income is almost a third lower than tenants in market-rate apartments. In the past decade alone, Manhattan has lost a fifth of its rent-regulated units. This trend, coupled with rent hikes that make even stabilized units unaffordable for low-income New Yorkers, threatens the vibrancy and integration of New York's neighborhoods. I'm almost done. New Yorkers in rent-regulated housing have suffered more rent increases than they can bear during a time of great economic hardship. While I am proud that the Council recently passed legislation to expand the income cap for SCREE program, which freezes rents for seniors in rent-regulated apartments whose rent exceeds 1/3 of their income, I ask you consider before you the vote the working people who have gone years without a raise and families who have no choice but to pack 5 or 6 people into 2 bedrooms. I ask that you consider these people and vote for a rent freeze this year. Thank
Speaker Mark Viverito, thank you so much for coming today and for your very eloquent statements. I would like to ask you about the owners of small buildings in your particular district, El Barrio, East Harlem, South Bronx. You speak on behalf of the tenants that are suffering high rent burdens, and many, I assume, many in your district receive housing subsidies, especially those that are very low income. What do you do about the owners of small buildings who we believe are struggling to maintain their housing for your tenant constituents? What would you say to them, and what are your thoughts regarding that part of your constituency?
Well, in listening to, first of all, by far, the constituents I represent in my district are primarily renters and very low-income people of color, as we all know, very much struggling to even be able to stay in New York City. So that, for me, is obviously of utmost urgency, but obviously now I have a role, right, that takes a look at a larger situation. Ownership in my district is minimal at all. Now, I understand in hearing the prior individual that testified, the woman, the small owner, and hearing the exchange, yes, there are challenges. But I think historically, when I mentioned in terms of the testimony, what we've looked at is decisions that have been to the detriment of tenants. Now we have an opportunity to kind of step back, reflect, and really take a position which is going to be helpful to those that have really been bearing the responsibility and the undue responsibility of a financial crisis. And so I think that that's what we have to do. I understand the challenges, and as policymakers, we can definitely delve into that further, but we are using the information that is before us. The information clearly states that it has been detrimental to the tenants, and those are the people that we represent here today. And I continue to believe strongly in a rent freeze, and that we do look at serious policy changes that we can implement, working alongside all of you and all the advocates that are here and the small owners. We're not going to shy away from that. But this is a really strong position I believe in, considering what we have seen about great segregation that is happening. Even in the borough of Manhattan, we're losing units left and right, and neighborhoods need to, the vibrancy of these of the constituents that are reflected in rent-stabilized units, and I believe strongly that I'm here to represent their voice, which has not been represented the past 8 years, or 12 years, actually. Thank you.
Speaker.
Yes.
Thank you very much for coming this afternoon, and I really appreciate your testimony. Two things I just would ask you. One is, as you probably know, under rent stabilization, there are hardship increases for landlords that are not making money. So there is law in place to protect the owners who aren't. But what do you say to the real estate industry who keeps saying to us, well, if there's a rent freeze, one, that's bad public policy, two, that'll cause a catastrophic outcome in New York City, will destroy, in some ways, destroy something in the real estate industry. What is your response to those arguments?
I mean, I really, it's shameful, I believe, the advertisements that we've been seeing lately. I think it's really implementing those fear tactics. We all know, you know, where we've come from, so to speak, as a city, right? And to try to really hit at people emotionally that way, I think is really unfair, and I think it's irresponsible. I think, again, that we have a real crisis in this city. This is ultimately what it is, and I think what we're asking, what we're saying through our testimony consistently as council members, is that now is an opportunity for everyone to sit at the table and do their due diligence and do their part. Right now, the Rent Guidelines Board in the past years, in the past administration, has been favorable to the landlords. Let's be clear. And it has not been favorable to the tenants. Now is an opportunity for us to sit at the table and really hear and figure out productive ways. But we're saying, I'm saying, at least in my testimony, that now we're asking the landlords to sit at the table and do your part for the city of New York. This is to the benefit of the city of New York. We need to be able to continue to have the vibrancy that we have, and that is what is really at stake here for New York City. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Speaker. If we could invite Manhattan Borough President Gail Brewer. welcome.
Thank you very much. My name is Gail Brewer. I'm the Manhattan Borough President, and I'd like to thank the chair and members of the Rent Guidelines Board for giving me this opportunity. As you know, Manhattan is home to some of the wealthiest neighborhoods. It also has some of the poorest and the most rent-burdened community districts in our city. Between 2002 and 2012, Manhattan lost nearly 100,000 units to destabilization. And this tremendous loss was not only the result of co-op and condo conversions and vacancy improvements pushing the rents over the regulated limit, it also resulted from the steady climb of regulated rents over the years as a result of renewal guidelines and the increases issued by this board. These increases have pushed regulated rents ever closer to the threshold for deregulation, which is a huge problem in Manhattan. They have made rents for many poor and working people in Manhattan less and less affordable and jeopardize the security of middle-income families. And I just want to answer that question about the small buildings, because we work a lot with them, and I want to say, at least in Manhattan, to answer the question, many, many buildings have both market rates and rent regulated. And it seems to me that a good reason to support a rent freeze is because so many buildings have both rent regulated and market, and the market can more than cover the cost of those buildings. I own a building. I do not have tenants, but I know to the penny how much it costs me every month, and I could definitely afford to pay the increased costs. It has not been so tremendous in the last few years, particularly with the increases that the board has gotten. So I believe you must take the most responsible course and approve a rent freeze. You may view a proposed 3 or 4% rent increase as minimal, but I urge you not to evaluate that percentage in isolation, standing alone, but in the full context of the last 10 or 15 years of consistent, substantial rent increases that have been imposed on tenants. It is the board's responsibility to try and balance the rights and interests of tenants, as you know, with those in the real estate industry. In New York, where market rate rent actually reflects a worldwide, often highly subsidized, inflated market, it's the city's interest in protecting housing for its native population and workforce. That must be, in my opinion, the determination. So I also want to talk about that whole issue with examples. Let me give you an example. A tenant who moved into an apartment in 2002 with a monthly rate of $900, this person has signed 2-year leases since and was lucky enough to not have had a major capital improvement. So she's now paying $1,260 per month. Within 5 of the 12 community districts in Manhattan, the median household income is below $42,000. And if you look at that as 30% of your income, she should really just be paying $1,000 a month in rent. Just to give an example of how challenging it is for tenants. And also, while annual rent increases may be acceptable if worker salaries are also being adjusted upwards at similar rates every year, this is not the case. And we know from Furman in a 2011 report that New York City has seen rent increases of almost 11% in the last 8 years, while median household incomes during the same period went up only by 2%. So you can see there's a widening gap that pushes households into becoming rent burdened. So I just want to say, as you know, I was in the city council for 12 years. I worked with rent and tenants for a very long time, and of course one of our major issues is when an apartment becomes vacant. And that's when owners immediately register a rent above the destabilized limit, and since that rent is far higher sometimes than the neighborhood will bear, tenants often run into the preferential issue, and that becomes a real challenge when all of a sudden the real rent appears and the tenant is stuck trying to pay that. That also needs to be figured into what your decision is made today. I just want to conclude by stating that the other issue, of course, is the rooming houses and the single room occupancy. I just want to be sure that you make, as part of your deliberations, there's a shrinking pool of SRO units. We want to make sure that they too have a zero rent increase as they have over the years. And I want to make sure that that continues. Finally, the issues, of course, that lead to tenants paying more than they ought to is that there's a measurement for the building operation costs that does not consider non-operating factors that bring in additional income for the building, such as the revenues, as I mentioned earlier, from the market rate units, including those in co-op and condo buildings. I think for the last 10 years, I'm one of the few speakers who keeps mentioning that, and I'm thinking that this time you're actually going to consider that. Until the board implements methods to do more accurately project net operating income based on disaggregated calculations that take the presence of market rate units into account, I am calling for the exemption of all buildings with both regulated and market rate units from being subjected to any annual rate adjustments. Thank you very much, and I appreciate the fact that you're spending all this time. Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Ms. Brewer. I'm sorry, I don't think I actually understood your last statement. You were saying that the income, the net operating income, you think did not actually include market rate units.
Yeah. What happens is, for years, as we know, particularly Manhattan, I can only speak for Manhattan, my district on the west side and certainly elsewhere, almost every building that has rent regulating, be they controlled or stabilized, also has market or condo or co-op. And that unit, those units often pay the increases that I think are necessary, be they property tax, insurance, and so on. So I've always felt that where you have a building that has both the market, the condo, and the co-op, and the rent regulated, there should not be any increase whatsoever. That was just an example. Over the years, may not be as relevant today because you're looking at a slightly different discussion. But in the past, I kept advocating for that.
I agree with you about one of the things that when we were looking at the RPIE information that I was surprised about was that they were looking at it on a building by building basis. But correct me if I'm wrong, Andrew, I do believe it actually does include, as long as a building is considered stabilized, even if it has one unit of stabilized rent, then all income is registered in the NOI calculation for buildings 10 units and above. Okay. So it does actually include...
It wasn't true in the past.
Okay, well, just to clarify, and also the NOI information that we've been hearing that came from the Rent Guidelines Board, as well as some of the data that's been coming back to us, has included the destabilized market rate units as well.
Thank you very much. Anything else? All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Just quickly, in Manhattan, since you're president of all of Manhattan, how catastrophic do you think a rent freeze would be? We've heard this rhetoric over and over again, and I would like for you to address it as the president of Manhattan.
Well, I think a rent freeze would give tenants a chance because to catch up with their with the fact that their income, as I said, is 2% increase in income and 11% increase in rents. That says it all. So I believe strongly that the tenants have had dramatic increases for the last 8 or 10 years, and this will get a chance for the tenants to be able to catch up their income to be able to pay the rent. I also believe, I understand that the Rent Guidelines Board is taking into account the market, condo, and co-op. But I still believe that when you have a building that whether they're half regulated, partially regulated with co-ops, condos, and market, those in Manhattan, those rents or maintenance are definitely picking up the increased costs in insurance, property tax, and so on. I know exactly how much more my building costs per year. If I was to have a market rate tenant, which I don't, I want to be clear, then I would be able to cover all my increased costs. So I don't understand why others can't do the same.
Sorry.
Thank you for your... Thank you for your testimony. Just a quick question. We've heard the real estate industry ask for 6, 7, 8% increases this year. What do you think that would happen to tenants in your borough? And what they're saying the balance of owners. What do you think, based on what you've testified for rent freeze, what do you think a proposal like that would do this city?
I think it would be devastating, partly because the salaries, if you look at the jobs that people are getting currently, the jobs are often lower wages, that people are getting jobs, but they're getting lower salaries than in the past. And if we want to keep a diverse middle-class community in Manhattan in particular, we're not going to be able to do it unless we continue to have some affordable rents. Now, of course, causing trouble. I'd love to see all the market rents be stabilized.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Excuse me. Chairwoman?
So if Councilman
Rachel? Sorry, one more follow-up question.
President Burr, one further question.
Sorry. Actually, I see a pattern, Harvey, of your question for all the politicians and people that are here. So I'm going to have my same question, actually two questions that I'll ask you as well. One is, then are you advocating for then a disregard for the increases in operating expenses for landlords, and at this, what you're recommending solely be looking at the tenant sort of aspect of and some people again disagree as to whether both sides are represented, but assuming that both sides are represented, you're advocating for just the tenant side to be represented in this year's deliberation?
No, I think both sides should be represented. I mean, I know lots and lots of small owners, hundreds of them, and I have many neighbors, and to be honest with you, in Manhattan, most of the small owners, many of them are now, like I said, dealing with market and rent regulated. And no, they are. I'm sorry. The ones I know are dealing with both. And when you have that situation, the market rate often helps balance the rent regulated, if that's your concern.
And my second question is, just the same terminology of catastrophic. How catastrophic would it be for your constituents, the tenant base, to experience a rent increase in the range in which the preliminary was based at between 0 and 3? So on the high end, 3% or somewhere in between.
I understand that. I mean, I understand that, and it would certainly be better than it has been in the past. But what I'm saying is that this year, because there have been such huge rent increases before your time in the past, I think it makes sense to balance it out this year with a 0 increase, and then look for next year and have further discussions.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If we could call City Councilman Dan Garodnick, and then Sandy Rosen and Benedicta Torres Lopez. Councilman Garodnick.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon to the chair and members of the Rent Guidelines Board. My name is Dan Garodnick, as you heard, and I represent the 4th District in the City Council, an area that stretches from 14th to 97th Streets in Manhattan. I also represent tens of thousands of rent-stabilized tenants from Stuyvesant Town to the Upper East Side. I am here to ask that you institute a rent freeze this year.
Thank you.
The safety and security that rent-stabilized housing provides for thousands of New Yorkers has been under a persistent threat, and the tenants in these units need relief. Now, I should note that that threat has come in a number of different ways. It has come, of course, through extremely high increases for them that they've had difficulty supporting. It's also come in the form of predatory equity, where people buy buildings for far too much money, or they borrow too much money and then take direct aim at those same rent-stabilized tenants. Since 1994, the first year for which data is available, we've added only 152,000 or so rent-stabilized units, while we've lost at least 256,000. This has meant 20 years of contracting affordable housing market, with the remaining affordable units becoming less affordable all the while. Over the past year, New Yorkers have seen mild economic progress, but it has not stemmed the tide of a housing market that grows more and more challenging. New Yorkers are once again struggling to afford rent increases, no matter how small. The 2014 Income and Affordability Study confirms this bleak reality, with a whopping 14.1% increase in city homeless shelter visits over the past year, and an average of over 49,000 occupants each night. Exacerbating this problem, city evictions continued to rise last year. With few options available to those who cannot afford rent, these figures are very troubling. Furthermore, there remains a dearth of housing options available in the city, with a meager 3.12% vacancy rate, according to the recent Housing and Vacancy Survey. This is well below the threshold of 5%, which dictates whether a housing emergency exists. The continued decrease in the availability of affordable housing units in the last year, paired with the mixed economic progress, creates a housing market that is extremely difficult for low and moderate income families. I will note that for the recent data from 2011 to 2012, net operating income for stabilized building owners increased by 9.6% over the previous data, contributing to the 8th consecutive yearly increase in a row. This is the year, I believe, for some relief, and I hope you will grant it to the tenants in these units. And on behalf of the thousands of rent-regulated tenants that I represent, I thank you for your consideration of these views. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions?
Councilman Garodnick, thank you very much for your statements. In particular, I'm very familiar with the constituents that you represent, and so it surprises me that you talked about the decrease in stabilized housing throughout the city, when in fact this year there have been an increase in rent-stabilized units based on the reports that we've received. And those reports did not even reflect the thousands of rent-stabilized units that have been now re-regulated thanks to members of your constituents in the Roberts litigation. So your math is a little bit off when you argue that there's been a decrease in stabilized housing. But more to the point, I'm not here to correct you. I'm here to ask you, there's a very strong possibility that housing of large complexes like Stuyvesant Town, Peter Cooper Village, in the future either could be purchased by the tenants or be converted into cooperatives or condominiums. If that were the case, either instance, and the costs of maintaining those buildings, it's a much older housing stock, it requires a lot of upkeep, and of course, assuming that there's no tax benefits in such a transaction, let's assume that those complexes have to pay the real estate taxes that the vast majority of rent-stabilized owners have to pay. How would your people that purchase those buildings be able to sustain them without a reasonable rent increase? I'd like just to get your thoughts on that.
Absolutely, and thank you for the questions. And I will note, despite their gotcha nature, I think that they deserve a response. The first is about mathematics. And perhaps you did not hear properly my testimony, which was not about the addition of rent-stabilized units to New York City's housing stock as a result of myself and my constituents demanding that landlords who were taking a tax abatement from the city, that they not contemporaneously be able to deregulate units as was decided by the Court of Appeals. But the statistic that I cited in my testimony was a 20-year statistic going back to 1994, and I will repeat it for you, which was that was the first year in which data was available, and we have added only 152,000 rent-stabilized units, while we have lost at least 256,000. So just to be clear, I was not speaking of the last year, although I do thank you for recognizing our advocacy on that front. And then when it comes to the cost of maintaining buildings, I'm very sensitive to the fact that it does cost money to maintain buildings, and certainly if we are so lucky to allow for tenant ownership in Stuyvesant Town and Peter Cooper Village, we as tenants will be struggling with many of these same questions. And your simple question was, how would you be able to sustain it if you didn't get a rent increase this year? And I think that
not this year. I was talking about reasonable, reasonable rent increases.
Okay,
imagine you, not you, of course, but your constituents being confronted to maintain those buildings and everything it takes to maintain them. And again, I have to preface it, without tax abatements, because many, many affordable housing projects throughout the city are able to maintain themselves because they do not pay real estate taxes. But let's assume that they are paying real estate taxes. How can you maintain these buildings?
So I would answer it by recognizing what the Rent Guidelines Board has done since 1990. And to the extent that the tenants were owners of Stuyvesant Town and Peter Cooper Village since 1990, we would have seen our costs go up by 143%, but we would have seen an authorization by this board of 177% increases. And I would say to that, well, we probably are doing better than the tenants in that circumstances if we were the owner, and I would say that this probably is the year to cut the tenants a break.
Thank you so much for your testimony.
Thank you.
Interesting way of Patrick Sinolfi, Benedicta Torres Lopez, and Andrew Hoffman, please. Yes, sir.
Did I get that wrong?
You're next.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Actually, Mr. Sukanolu is next, and then you, ma'am.
There's another gentleman has to go to work, and I'm going to give him mine, and then...
Oh, no. Are you okay with having her testify before she goes to go to work? Thank you. Ma'am, he's willing to cede his place so that you can testify before you go to work. Absolutely.
No, I don't have to go to work.
You want to give her turn to somebody else?
Yes.
Oh, okay, then how about after he testifies, the other person can come and testify?
That's fine with me, but I'll go after the other gentleman. Thank you.
So we can cooperate at times.
And we very much appreciate that.
Thank you. So good afternoon. I'm Pat Sicanalfi. I'm the Executive Director of the Community Housing Improvement Program, or CHIP. CHIP is a trade association representing about 3,500 owners of multifamily property in the city, and among CHIP's owners, CHIP's members, they own about 350,000 units of housing. CHIP's members are primarily small, but also medium-sized members. And I'm going to ask you just to bear with me. I'm struggling with a little bit of a hoarse throat here, so just bear with me. But I have testimony. I'll give it over so it can be part of the record, but it's actually thrilling to speak after so many unscheduled speakers, and it gives me an opportunity to comment on a number of things that they said. There's a lot of disinformation which I've heard here this afternoon. I want to comment on it, so I'm going to go out of my testimony. First of all, I think that there are some comments that talking about the willingness of developers and developers doing, having lots of work and lots of business. We are not developers. And I think there's a tendency, certainly in the public mind and the caricature of what owners are, is that we're developers and we're rich developers. We're not. That's not who we are. That's not who I represent. That's not most of the people who are providing the bulk of the affordable housing to the people of this city. We are owners who are struggling. And one of the reasons we're struggling, or one of the indicators that we're struggling, has to do with the profit margins that are available in our industry. And I recently had a discussion with someone who said to me that no one misunderstands net operating income as profit. And I said, well, wait till you come to the hearing. And virtually every speaker here has confused net operating income with profit, and used the term here to implore you to freeze the rents. Now, net operating income is irrelevant to this discussion. What matters to this discussion is profit. And net operating income does not include capital expenses. It does not include financing costs, mortgage costs. And when you add those in, very few of the properties that we represent would actually be profitable or just marginally profitable. So I want to get that point out. The other point I want to make is that you talked about a catastrophe before, what the catastrophe is. I'll tell you what the catastrophe is. It's not, the walls aren't going to fall down, but what's going to happen is disinvestment. And if every developer keeps developing, and if the mayor is successful in building all of the affordable housing that he intends to build, and I hope that he is, even then, the housing shortage will grow worse. Okay? And what that means is that the shortage is in investment. And one of the biggest reasons there's a shortage in investment of private money into housing is what's done here. There are other reasons too, but this is a very important reason. It causes disinvestment. And when you cause disinvestment, the other thing happens, which is part of the catastrophe, is you cause consolidation. You've heard small owners here talk about at some point it's not going to be worthwhile. And what happens is you force out the small owner, who's, from a public policy standpoint, you want here. You force out the small owner, and what happens is a corporate interest can pick that up on the fly. That's not what we want as public policy here, and so that's what I would have to say.
Thank you so much. I have two questions.
Sure.
One is, what percentage of your members have tenants who sign 2-year leases versus 1-year leases?
Well, we don't study that directly. We would hope that you would, but it's...
We do have that data. Right. I didn't know if there was anything
like
unique
60,
about
I know
your
you talked about 50-50. It's more like 60-40.
60% sign 2-year leases?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. That's very useful. The second question is, I do understand the difference between net operating
you were the one who said it.
Profits, but I think what seems like it's salient, and I'm curious to hear your explanation as to why it's not, because the net operating income concept over the past 12 years that everyone's been referencing never included capital expenses or debt service.
And
right?
that's been... Oh, sorry. Yeah.
So it never included those expenses, correct?
That's correct.
So if there has been a growth in net operating expenses income over time, isn't that still salient for us to think about?
Absolutely not. And first of all, yes, you're correct. It's been, you've always had this mistaken number in there, and I've said it every year in my testimony. You can go back and look. So there's a public record of the board being on notice that it's wrong. Second of all, capital expenditures. See, the board does something which we think is very prejudicial, because when you're looking at the owner's performance, his his or her financial performance, you look at the revenue from capital projects, but you don't look at the expense from capital projects. So it's already a fake number. And the way you do that is by only looking at net operating income. So capital costs are going up. As the building stock gets older, and New York is famous for its aging building stock, capital investment increases. And so that's one reason. That's the second reason. And then, of course, there's the financing cost. I mean, most of our owners are small and medium-sized people. I mean, you can do a calculation from our general numbers that they're not large holders of property. And the point is that they don't have the resources to just buy a building. I mean, they're like you and me. If we're going to buy something, we have to get a mortgage. And very few people are in a position to buy a building or even to maintain the capital side of the building without financing it. It's just the cash flows. The cash flows don't provide for any other way to do it. So that's why NOI is irrelevant, because you can't run a building without those two very large expenses.
Mr. Sekunalfi, could you discuss the difference between the regulated housing stock and the affordable housing stock? That is, the projects that operate by not-for-profit organizations that provide, for example, a certain percentage of housing for low-income people, and in consideration, the developer can then develop it with market rentals. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about those differences and why rent-regulated housing should not be lumped together with this notion of the affordable housing stock?
Well, there's several ways to answer this question, but one of the principal reasons is the tax treatment. Our owners generally pay full taxes, and we had some interesting public officials here who they're the ones who are raising the rent on tenants, not landlords, and not even you guys. It's the public officials, because they raise the taxes, the property taxes every year, and the property taxes, 40 cents of every dollar spent from the budget of a rent-stabilized building goes to pay the city of New York, 40%. 40 cents out of the dollar. So when you add in the property tax, which is the lion's share of it, and the water and sewer charges, and what we call the death by 1,000 cuts with all the other fees, almost 40% of that budget goes to pay the city of New York. Now, when that happens, and that number is skyrocketing, because that, we had people here who said they don't want you to raise rent, but they want to raise taxes. How does that, in what bizarre world does that take place? So I don't know if that answers your question. Maybe there's another aspect to it that you were looking at.
That's a major difference, right?
Any further questions?
There was one other difference, is that affordable housing, regulated affordable housing has income standards, and rent-stabilized housing has no income standards. So the city's own data shows that about 20% of all the housing, of all the rent-stabilized housing, is occupied by prosperous and wealthy New Yorkers. If there's such a housing emergency, why are they there? Okay?
Thank you so much.
Hi, thank you for your testimony. I just want to ask you about, you kept mentioning capital, and I think about MCIs every time you say that, and how they're permanent, and how it's another increase tenants face. And two questions, right? How do you, how do you take that into account, right? And also the fact that, if you're in it, it's a business, right? You're making some kind of profit, and that's a profit you kind of sign on to. And I was wondering about what that profit looks like for the people that you represent. And you said 350,000 people, units, right? Units, and so it's really amazing that you have, I'm assuming you have that data, and I would love to hear about what that looks like.
Good question. So one of the points that I've been making for years is that you meaning the board, has a staff which produces the data. I mean, I don't have a staff to produce research data. What we have is something very different, which I'll tell you in a minute. But you have the staff to provide research data, and when you provide the research data, and nothing about the staff, I mean, they do a great job, but when you provide the research data, for whatever reason, you exclude this piece. And it doesn't make sense that you would exclude this piece. And I don't mean you personally, I mean the board,
So just, I'm clear. I think I hear you saying that small property owners should be treated differently than large property owners.
I didn't say that anywhere.
So you're saying that we should be thoughtful about small property owners' needs and in making our determination. I assume that means versus other property owners.
No, I didn't say that at all. I didn't use the word. No, I didn't introduce that concept. So my point is this, that property taxes, so you rent stabilized property, all of it, regardless of the size of the building, is all taxed in the way that I was discussing in response to Magda's question. So that is true. That 40% statistic is true across the board. So how does, and by the way, it's the biggest expense we pay,
right,
and it's the one that's growing the fastest.
Right.
And so how does a building of any size pay a number that's skyrocketing like that?
But some property owners are doing well. Some people are making good money off rent-stabilized housing, their buildings in the city of New York. That's probably correct, right?
Still legal for now? Still legal for today, right?
Say that again?
Never mind. The point is, if there is, so what is your point? I mean, so what? The point is that the majority of them are not in that category. The majority of them are not the big developers.
So that's where I think we disagree. I think the majority of them are in that category. So maybe we should just stop. Let's go.
Okay. Good. Good.
I was given time by a previous speaker.
Can you tell us your name, please?
Brian Dillon. I think I was originally scheduled for place number 10.
We are on speaker number 5, which is why you haven't spoken yet, but thank you.
Okay. Well, is it okay? It's just a brief thing. I'm recounting an experience that happened to me about 10 years ago. I moved from an apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan to Astoria for personal reasons. I wasn't getting along with the person who had the apartment. A real estate agent in Astoria, where I decided to move, obtained for me a garden apartment in a house occupied by the landlady for $800 a month. Soon after moving in, I realized that the landlady would play loud TV at 7 a.m. I work at night. I go to bed around 4 or 5 a.m. I was getting 2 or 3 hours of sleep a night. I talked to her daughter, and son-in-law, and all to no avail. While she did turn her TV down somewhat, I was still awakened every morning by some form of noise, radio, loud phone conversations, heavy walking up and down stairs, etc., etc. After 3 months, I moved out. My next apartment was in a regular apartment house. It wasn't too long before problems developed there too. A self-appointed apartment vigilante living directly above me decided that I was a drug user and tried to make me stop using drugs by stomping on his floor repeatedly and dropping heavy objects over my head. This approach didn't work since I wasn't using drugs in the first place. I became aware in due time that the tenant on the floor above him was an avid marijuana smoker, and I was being blamed for someone else's behavior. Attempts to talk to my neighbor upstairs didn't work, and the landlord refused to get involved. I was forced to vacate my apartment during evening hours when the man upstairs was at home, and as a result of his banging, I developed a case of sleep apnea. The brain fails to regulate breathing, and the sleeper is deprived of oxygen while asleep. It is a potentially lethal condition. It persists to an extent till to today. Overall, I spent $10,000 in rent while I was in Astoria, paid at least $800 in agents' fees for 2 bad apartments, and sacrificed $850 in security deposit money when I broke the lease on my last apartment. It was money not well spent. The only lasting effect was diminished health. Now, to sum up, I recount this story in order to point out that being removed from your home does not simply mean, quote unquote, finding another place to live. The pitfalls can be terrifying and costly. You can lose money to bad real estate agents, bad landlords, and disruptive neighbors. You can lose your health also. I was lucky to find a decent alternative, but at a great, almost unaffordable cost. I now pay 60% of my salary for rent. I hope no other person has to go through what I did. I also realize there's a financial incentive for a real estate agent to give you an apartment that isn't very good, because you'll move out and he can get another real estate agent's fee a few months later from someone else and give you a bad apartment. And also the landlord's benefit, because you're breaking your lease and sacrificing your security deposit.
Thank you so much for your testimony.
Okay.